Welcome to the first keynote session of Psykedeelit 2021. I have the pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Peter Sjöstedt-Hughes from University of Exeter, UK. Peter is a pioneer in philosophical research of psychedelics and has laid the ground for what could be called a philosophical content analysis of psychedelic experiences. While it is an empirical question what psychedelic insights are, it is a philosophical task to elaborate them and to examine whether they could be true. Peter approaches this question by drawing from the work of classic figures in philosophy, such as Spinoza, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche. He co-leads the Philosophy of Psychedelics Exeter Research Group with Professor Christine Haus-Heller, and this year they organized the first international conference devoted to philosophy of psychedelics. They have co-edited the volume Philosophy and Psychedelics, forthcoming on Bloomsbury Academic. And Peter's talk today is titled Philosophy of Psychedelics. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you, Jussi. First of all, I'd like to say thanks to you and thanks for the organizers of this conference. So good to have another Scandinavian conference on academic psychedelia. So I'm honored and delighted to be here. My talk today then is the question philosophy of psychedelics, or what is philosophy of psychedelics? So it's going to be a general question, a general talk, really sort of trying to highlight this new emerging field. I assume that not everyone is a philosopher here, so I'm going to divide this talk into 5 Ps, not of marketing, but of philosophy here. So first of all, I'm going to just quickly sort of discuss what philosophy is. Secondly, I'm going to talk about what psychedelics are, or my understanding of them. Then I'm going to quickly go through the past or the history of philosophers' approach to psychedelic use or psychoactive drugs. The fourth part, potential, is the bit I'm going to focus on mostly. So that's going to be the different areas or the sub-branches of philosophy of psychedelics. And then lastly, I'll end on the personal. So I'll tell you a little bit more about the projects we have got going in Exeter and elsewhere, and new opportunities for potential researchers and so on. So let me begin by asking this very basic question: what is philosophy? This is a philosophical question in itself, and there's no easy answer. But I think very generally one can divide it into 3 parts. Firstly, there's axiology, which is the study of values. So that ramifies into aesthetics and ethics, especially epistemology, the study of knowledge, which is very important, I think, to this field, and metaphysics, likewise important. To ramify them a little bit more here, so we have, with axiology, then aesthetics, ethics, but then ethics, diverges ramifies further into political philosophy, environmentalism, nihilism, and so on. Epistemology, we look at, well, that's a field in itself, but it also includes logic, philosophy of science, which is very relevant here, I think, etc. And then metaphysics, which is really my preferred area of philosophy, as well as philosophy of mind, which is then the metaphysical systems, great, physicalism, dualism, idealism, and so on. Analytic metaphysics, questions about what is a cause, what is substance, what is identity, and so on. Philosophy of religion, of course, and theology applies here. I heard that there was a theological talk just now, which sounded very interesting. Then importantly, at least in my mind, is philosophy of mind, which doesn't really fit into any of these exactly. I mean, it's related to metaphysics, related to epistemology, and of course, I mean, the value of truth. Truth is a controversial word, but truth flows through all of this, of course. Phenomenology, which is, I think, a very important subfield of philosophy, which can be applied when we talk about psychedelic experience. Of course, we divide these things to teach them or to sort of give a general overview of what philosophy is, but in reality, they all intertwine, of course. These are just abstractions. But anyway, in a moment, I'm going to look at how we can apply certain of these different subfields to psychedelia. But first of all, let me ask the question, what psychedelics are. This is a picture of it's a random picture I got from the internet, which I didn't take myself, of a liberty cap mushroom, one of the most potent magic mushrooms in the world. Apparently they grow all around me here, so I'm told. And they contain the active ingredient psilocybin, psilocin, but also other active compounds. But what are psychedelics? Now, normally you'd get a sort of division into tryptamines and phenethylamines, but I'm going to take another route now and talk about the origin of the word psychedelic and how it was originally framed, which I think is quite useful. So the word, as you probably know, psychedelics was coined in 1956 or 57 by the psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond. Humphrey Osmond was a friend of Aldous Huxley. I say 56, 57 because he had some correspondence with Huxley talking about a new name for these psychoactive substances. But he didn't publish this name until 1957 in the paper that's referenced below there. But anyway, this is interestingly how he defines it. I mean, these are just extracts from the whole paper, of course. He writes, one or more sensory modalities combined with mood, thinking, and often to a marked degree, empathy, usually change. Most subjects find the experience valuable, some find it frightening, and many say that it is uniquely lovely. All agree that much of it is beyond verbal description. So that last part, of course, refers to, the notion of ineffability that William James spoke about, and Humphrey Davey even spoke about before then, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. Osmond writes as well, has our comparative neglect of these experiences, recognized by James and Bergson as being of great value, rendered psychology stale and savorless, tasteless? So interestingly, although he was a psychiatrist, Humphrey Osmond saw immediately the philosophical potential of psychedelics. This was sort of integrated in the very first paper that defined the term. He writes, I've tried to find an appropriate name for the agents under discussion, a name that will include the concepts of enriching the mind and enlarging the vision. My choice, because it is clear, euphonious, and uncontaminated by other associations, is psychedelic, mind manifesting. So that's the original published use of the word. We have debates sometimes about whether we should use this word still because of later associations with the people of the 60s, but I think it's still a good word to use. To play in our survival as a species. I'll repeat that because my internet connection is unstable, apparently. I believe that these agents have a part to play in our survival as a species. For that, survival depends as much on our opinion of our fellows and ourselves as on any other single thing. The psychedelics help us to explore and fathom our own nature. So interestingly here, Humphrey Osmond talks about the sort of sociological potential of psychedelics, more than mere therapy. He writes this, perhaps most important, there are social, philosophical, and religious implications in the discoveries made by means of these agents. So again, right from the start, Humphrey Osmond waxing lyrical about the philosophical implications of psychedelics. Of course, he was a psychiatrist, so he looked into that. And this is the current kind of focus at the moment on psychedelia. But there is so much more. This philosophical aspect of psychedelics, which was there at the start of the coining of the term, at least, and also before that in William James, 50 years before, seems to have been neglected for various historical reasons. Humphrey Osmond himself, on the right there, he wrote a paper in 1971, I believe, about the philosophical implications of psychedelics. He was very good friends with Aldous Huxley and John Smithies, and they tried to create this conference, which I say is the greatest thing that never happened in psychedelia, called Outsight in the mid-50s or late 50s, whereby they would bring together the world's leading intellectuals and thinkers, people like, I think invited were A.J. Ayer, de Cass, H.H. Price, Jung, Einstein, Graham Greene. They were going to bring these people together and give them mescaline and then ask them to write about it and talk about it. And they thought they were going to get this the funding from the Ford Foundation, but in the end, they didn't get it, unfortunately. If that had happened, I think philosophy of psychedelics would have been a branch in universities since. But unfortunately, it didn't happen. And I won't talk about the history after that, but as you all know it. Okay, so that's what I understand by psychedelics. It's very broad, and interestingly, Osmond includes, by implication, nitrous oxide as a psychedelic. A number of people question this because it's not a typical, it doesn't relate to the serotonin receptors and so on. But he talks about it thus in relation to William James. Interestingly, I've also realized recently with work I'm doing with psychologists at Exeter that ketamine also can be defined as a psychedelic, especially in large enough doses. But I can talk about that later. Anyway, now I'm going to look at an overview of the history of philosophy and psychedelics, just quickly, really. But there's a chapter in my new book about it, if you want to look at that in a bit more detail. So we go back to ancient Greece, as we're talking here. I'm talking here about Western philosophy. Of course, there was probable psychoactive drug use in Greece before the philosophers got on the scene, for example, in Orphism. This is something Bergson talks about, for example, which probably influenced Pythagoras, Bergson says, and so on. But the first sort of known philosopher, really, who is associated with psychedelics in terms of evidence we have, albeit minimal, is Democritus. So the first, who is a materialist, atomist materialist, with his mentor Leucippus. But he actually created, it's lost now, but a taxonomy of psychoactive plants. And he was said to have gone mad and traveled through the boundless. So it starts there, interestingly, with atomism. Plato, Bergson also talks about Plato being influenced by the mysteries. This is very speculative, but I mean, most Greeks participated in the Eleusinian mysteries, 13 miles from Athens. And it was a sort of mystery religion that lasted 2,000 years or so, till about the 4th century, well, until 392 AD specifically. It was closed down by the Christian emperor, Theodosius. But Greeks participated in the mysteries, we know that. The question is whether the potion they took there, the kykeon, which was of a specific dose and for which one had to fast, contained a psychoactive ingredient. Many people, like Albert Hofmann, who created LSD, said it probably did, but this demands further research. But Plato, for example, in the Phaedo on the soul, he writes, "I want to be counted amongst the mystics." Before he talks about his, this is where his famous dualism was first enunciated. And then in the Phaedrus, he has a kind of, what sounds like a psychedelic trip about the train of Zeus and so on. And whether it was occasioned by psychedelic substances or not, it was still akin to a psychedelic experience. But anyway, moving on 2,000 years. There's a bit of a gap there, obviously, and that's partly because the mysteries were closed down. I really should have included the Neoplatonists from Plotinus to Proclus, the first few centuries AD, because of their potential dallying with, certainly with the mysteries, at least Proclus. But there's not quite enough evidence, at least not that I've seen. So we move through the Dark Ages and look at one of the first English commentators of Kant, Thomas de Quincey, who was an opium addict, wrote a book about it, Confessions of an English Opium Eater. At these high doses, psychedelics were kind of, opium can be sort of induced psychedelic states. Also, interestingly, he talks about the recall of complete memory, like the exact occasions of a certain birthday in his childhood and so on. he was De Quincey was associated with the Romantic poets in Britain, like Wordsworth and Coleridge and Southey and so on. In that circle was the local man, Sir Humphrey Davey. The statue is 7 miles from here in the town of Penzance. He called himself a chemical philosopher. Today we'd call him a chemist, but he took 200 pints of nitrous oxide and declared himself to be an idealist in the Kantian sense. But he also wrote an interesting poem called The Spinozist. And in my book, I've got a chapter on him and his use and its relation to Spinozism. There's a German TV crew actually coming down in a few weeks to film this statue and talk about his use, so I can expand on that later if you like. Nietzsche, well, I did an essay on Nietzsche's kind of psychoactive drug use. He was sort of, because of extreme migraines, he took a lot of drugs, opium, chloral hydrate, especially potassium bromide. He mixed them, he got anything he wanted in the pharmacy because he said, honestly, in a shallow sense, that he was a doctor. I can talk about that later as well. Of course, also his philosophy starts and ends with the god of intoxication, Dionysus. Concurrent to Nietzsche was one of the most important philosophers, really, in the study of the philosophy of psychedelics, William James. In his book Varieties of Religious Experience of 1902, he talks about mystical states, and then he incorporates psychedelic substances, including nitrous oxide, into that. So this is an interesting question, whether mystical states in the theological canon can be equated to those in the psychedelic, to those induced by psychedelics. William James says they do. I mean, he says alcohol is the first step into the mystical consciousness. People were horrified by this at the time. Henri Bergson writes about it a little bit on the two sources of morality and religion. William James, I should say, was influenced by another philosopher, non-academic philosopher called Benjamin Paul Blood, who wrote about nitrous oxide as a mystical stimulant. Again, all of this can be expanded upon. Henri Bergson, then he was in correspondence with James. He talks about like this amazing he never took what we call psychedelics today, as far as I'm aware, but he had these amazing, he had this one particular amazing dream, which reads like a psychedelic DMT trip, really. And he corresponded with James about how he should push this forward. And he writes about, as I mentioned, Plato in relation to Orphism in his last book and so on. Also, he's important in this field because Aldous Huxley, in his book, The Doors of Perception, in the mid-50s, he refers to his whole theory about psychedelic consciousness is the so-called reducing valve theory, and he refers that to Bergson's theory about consciousness, how the brain doesn't create consciousness, it receives it, and so on. This is interesting with regard to the latest research from David Nutt, which I can talk about later. Walter Benjamin also took hashish, mescaline, other drugs, wrote about it, posthumously at least, published it. Someone published it posthumously. There's a book by Sebastian Marincolo who says that Benjamin's psychedelic use informed his notion of functional displacement, the notion of aura. Walter Benjamin was persecuted by the Nazis and really hated the next person I'm going to talk about because he was a captain in the Second World War for the Nazis, although he refused to join the Reichstag. That was Ernst Jünger. His works have rarely been translated into English. He coined the term psychonaut in 1970. He wrote this fictional piece called Visit to Godenholm in 1954, I believe, just before Huxley wrote his Doors of Perception. And he was a very good friend of Albert Hofmann. Albert Hoffman's, in his book, Albert Hofmann, again, who discovered LSD, in his book, LSD, My Problem Child, he's got a whole chapter devoted to Jünger. They took LSD together, psilocybin together, and exchanged thoughts, philosophical thoughts about it. But he's little known in the English-speaking world. I don't know about Finland, you can tell me that. In Sweden, his book called Psykonauterna in Swedish, where he coins the term psychonaut, is translated into Swedish, interestingly, but not English. Michel Foucault. He took a lot of people know now the two books on him taking LSD in 1975 in California desert. But he wrote a piece in 1970 on LSD, Theatricum Philosophicum, I think it was. And just before he died in 1984, he said he wanted to write a history of Western drug use. Unfortunately, this didn't happen. Also, interestingly, in relation to him, of course, is his notions of how sort of diagnoses of mental conditions are very much influenced by sociological beliefs. So, for example, nymphomania was deemed a mental problem in the Victorian age because of their sociological values. This plays some part in the new sort of medicalization of psychedelics now. Christine Hauskeller, my colleague, she writes about this to a certain extent in her chapter in the book I'll talk about. And here's another philosopher that's little known, really. He called himself a neurophilosopher, John Smithies. He only died a couple of years ago. I had some correspondence with him, luckily. He wrote a piece about mescaline, about the mescaline experience in relation to philosophy in the early 50s, and it was referred to in The Doors of Perception. He was a friend of Huxley's, and he went to Saskatchewan University in Canada with Humphrey Osmond. Interestingly as well, philosophically, he was a big critic. Although he called himself a neurophilosopher, he was a big critic of the identity theory, psychoneural identity theory, and he spoke about the relationship between mind and different different dimensions of space, hyperspace and so on. Again, I've written about this in my new book. Okay, now, so there's a little bit of history, and also that shows you a few potential avenues which can be researched further. But let me elaborate on that a little now. So we looked at these sort of aspects of philosophy. I'm sure many philosophers will disagree with this sort of breakdown, but as you have to break it down one way or another, I'm going to do that. So let's see how these apply to psychedelics. Well, first of all, let's look at metaphysics. So mystical experiences then are one thing which are explained, phenomenologically often. But what do they mean? How do we sort of gauge the ontological status of them, the veridicality of them or otherwise? Well, one way in which you can do it is relate mystical experiences, as I have done, to classic metaphysical positions. So, for example, in the chapter in this forthcoming book, I speak about Spinoza's monism and pantheism and his third kind of knowledge, intuition, in relation to psychedelic experiences, especially that occasioned by 5-MeO-DMT, which is a kind of mostly non-perceptual yet extremely profound form of psychedelic experience. There was this Swedish scholar who died a few years ago called Patrick Lundborg, who said that one of the core tenets or values of psychedelia was monism and pantheism. Yet very little has been done to actually compare psychedelic phenomenology to such metaphysical points of view. Also, I should say, and this is something I'm sort of moving into now, deep ecology, founded by the Norwegian philosopher Arne Næss, had its basis in Spinozism and also Whitehead's thought and Heidegger's to a certain extent. So I'm looking at the relationship between particular kinds of mystical states in relation to Spinozism and deep ecology and environmentalism generally. Another form of metaphysics which I find very applicable to the psychedelic state is process philosophy, or Whitehead's philosophy of organism, because one reason of many is that he includes this new form of perception which he calls prehension, which he takes from Bergson a little bit, which is the notion that the object and subject merge, and that's why he's a realist, as opposed to one creating a representation of an unknown outside world in the Kantian sense. But nonetheless, there's interesting things to be said about Kant's transcendental idealism, Schelling's as well, and others, in relation to perceptions of reality which break out of normal perception, and thus in relation to the world in itself, or the noumenal realm, as Kant says. There was an Italian student who recently won an award for an essay on Schelling's relationship to psychedelic experience, awarded by Breaking Convention, the conference. Another interesting thing that I've mentioned, the Bergson-Huxley reducing valve and his notion of mind at large in relation to psychedelics. I mean, so, we can now bring in latest neuroscience in relation to this. Interestingly, David Nutt, the psychopharmacologist David Nutt, who's a sort of friend of mine, we're kind of about to co-write a book actually on the philosophy and science of psychedelics. But he says, Huxley was right. The latest brain imaging shows that Huxley was right with his theory. So we're going to go into the details of that. Another really interesting debate relating to this is that between perennialism and contextualism. So perennialism is the view that the ultimate sort of mystical state, the unitive state, is perennial. It's the same throughout culture, transcends culture and time. And different religions, basically, they interpret it in different ways, but really they're speaking about the same thing. This, Huxley is the sort of epitome of this view. This is opposed to contextualism, which is the view that no, your culture completely conditions the experience you have, not just the interpretation, but the experience itself. Stephen Katz, in the 70s, wrote a really seminal text about this, which is very good. For example, where he says, when people say unity, I mean, unity in Jewish mysticism is very distinct from, unity in Zen Buddhism, the void, this, right? So that debate really demands for a greater taxonomy of certain states, beyond that of Stace and Pankey and so on. So the real question here, are psychedelic experience conditioned by culture, or do they decondition one from culture? There are, of course, middle views as well. Another interesting question related here too is, do psychedelic experiences alter people's metaphysical viewpoints? We had Chris Timmerman come into Exeter last week to speak about his paper with Robin Carhart-Harris and others, saying that they do. This paper was a bit, it can be improved. For example, it didn't even include the option of monism, pantheism. However, there's an interesting research to be continued there. Also, the nature of time, the species present, often the present, the sort of duration of the present, as it were, something that Brentano and Husserl speak about, it seems to be stretched. The rhythm of duration, as Bergson calls it, the speed of time, the slowing down of time. Until it stops, timeless experience is commonly reported, something I mentioned in relation to Spinozism. The nature of space as well. As I said, we can talk about the nature of n-dimensional space, so space of more than 3, but 4, 5, 6 dimensions. Mathematically, we know this is coherent since Riemann, Gauss and Riemann, really. But, there are interesting reports that people have seen space more than 3 dimensions. I don't include time, so let's say 5 dimensions. Does one trust such reports? Is this possible? This also relates to ineffability, which I'll mention in a moment. The somatic nature of space, bodily space. Merleau-Ponty speaks about this a little bit. It can be expanded on. Visual space, as I mentioned, twofold space. I've got a chapter on this in my book, conceptual space, and so on. The nature of space can be spoken about theoretically, but psychedelics seem to allow one to experience space, have a sort of empirical experience, a notion of space, which is a non-prosaic. Another interesting thing that I'm sort of working on a little bit is Amerindian metaphysics conditioned by psychedelic use. So in Exeter, we have the great anthropologist, Luis Eduardo Luna, join us. He's an expert in the sort of indigenous American cultures and their psychedelic uses. And it's interesting how this often differs. Their psychedelic use is not, they don't come to this unitive experience that as Westerners and Easterners often speak about, but it seems somewhat different. But when you look into it, maybe it's not that different. Anyway, it demands further research. Philosophy of mind, my main area really, as well as metaphysics. There's an interesting question about mental causation and psychedelic therapy. Does the experience itself have therapeutic benefits, or is it the sort of subvening physical correlates that do? The nature of memory, as I mentioned, De Quincey speaks about the complete recall of memory. Stan Grof also, of course, speaks about perinatal memory in relation to LSD. Famously, the nature of the self. What is the self? Is it an illusion? One often, this is a cliche now, but one experiences ego loss to some extent. Does that relate to an infinite intellect, a mind at large? What does unity mean in relation to the self? You know, one loses oneself, one becomes one with everything, the oceanic experience, as Freud called it in relation to Romain Rolland. Demands further work. Multiple realization. Why is it that different psychedelics, for example, LSD and Salvia divinorum, have very somewhat similar phenomenological qualities, yet the sort of subvening neurological base is different, something to look at. Generally, the neural correlates of consciousness can be understood better with looking at psychedelic forms of consciousness. Panpsychism, something I did my PhD on. This is related to, there are studies by Sam Gandhi and others looking at how psychedelics seem to amplify the sense of nature connectedness. Now, interesting question there, which has mental health benefits. But the interesting question with relation to the mind and metaphysics is that experience of connection veridical to a certain extent, in other words, objectively true, or is it just a hallucination? How could it be veridical? Well, panpsychism goes part of the way looking at that. In other words, there's intrinsic forms of subconscious, probably sentience in in plants and fungi and so on. Another interesting thing when you sort of when philosophers look at try to distinguish percepts from concepts, often in psychedelic experience these fuse. Synesthesia, one hears colors, one sees sounds, and so on. Quite common. What does this mean for the noumenal reality if you take a Kantian sense? Often one has novel qualia, by which I mean that one experiences things that one has never experienced before and cannot categorize them under a percept, a concept, an emotion, a memory, an imagination, or whatever. They're completely new. How does that relate to the question of universals or essences? Very interesting question. No one's really done any work on it. All of these can be turned into PhDs, of course. And then generally, if you want to sort of go to the extremity of philosophy of mind, we can look at higher states of consciousness, cosmic consciousness, as Edward Carpenter called it, or Aaron Buck, James, and so on. There's an interesting, cosmic consciousness became a sort of prevalent term in the 60s. You look at the history of that, it's very interesting because it goes back to then William James, 1902, Aaron Buck, 1901, his book of that name, and it goes back further to Edward Carpenter, like I said. But at the time, the British idealists were talking about eternal consciousness. So it's very interesting how that cosmic consciousness relates to British idealists. British idealists in turn were very much influenced by Hegel. So more work to be done there. Phenomenology, of course, this study of experience itself without any question of ontological status generally. So a taxonomy of psychedelic states is much needed. The perceptions of time and space are part of that, as I've sort of mentioned. The relativity of ineffability. In other words, if you know about, let's say, n-dimensional space and you see it, it wouldn't be ineffable, but it would be ineffable to someone who doesn't know about it. Merleau-Ponty has spoken about mescaline and Alice in Wonderland syndrome. This could be expanded because it's very minimal. A good psychedelic phenomenology is very important for a good empirical neural correlation, because without the phenomenology, you don't know what to correlate it to. So phenomenology is very important really for the neuroscience, I would say. The appreciation of beauty is significantly intensified. The abrogation of will sort of stops, practical will stops. So we can look at microdosing if that really works. So psychedelics as nootropics. As I mentioned, we can look at the varieties of unitive consciousness. Epistemology, again, we determine the veridicality of psychedelic experience. Are they just hallucinations, or are they revelations, or otherwise? We can look at realism. Representationalism. We can look at the axioms and rules of logic. Michel Weber speaks about this in the book coming up. A philosophy of science is very interesting, the tension of religious mystical experience within scientific clinical trials. Hauskeller speaking about this in the book a little bit. The neural correlates of mystical psychedelic experience in relation to Bergson James, as I mentioned, with Nut, nature connectedness. Then I think philosophers can scrutinize the methodologies of certain scientific psychedelic studies, because many of them, for example, many questionnaires are based on questionnaires from Stace, which in turn are based on certain theological frameworks. Aesthetics, there's going to be a conference on the aesthetics of psychedelics next year, probably. I can tell you more about that later. Ethics, I mean, the fact that we're in the renaissance of psychedelics now brings up with it many ethical questions about patents, about piracy, appropriation, cultural appropriation, about cognitive liberty with regard to the law, liberalism, the ethical status of the war on drugs, psychedelic ethical standard boards, what's the criteria, what's the standards, the interesting contrast between medicalization and legalization. One can bring in critical theory. One can even look at nihilism. I mean, Russell said, mystical states takes one beyond good and evil. Octavio Paz writes that psychedelic experiences also take one in a Nietzschean sense out of good and evil. We can look at Chris Leatherby's got a book called Philosophy of Psychedelics out, which is based on the comforting delusion objection, which is the view that assuming naturalism or physicalism, then these unitive states are illusions, but they still are therapeutic. So is that an ethical form of therapy? And then we can look at cultural shifts from endorsing psychedelics in society. Okay, I think that I'm probably, no, I've got a few more minutes, great. Okay, so I'm just gonna tell you a little bit more. All of those things I can talk about in the Q&A, of course. A little bit of personal stuff now, just to let you know where we are in Exeter. So we have this Philosophy and Psychedelics Exeter Research Group. We have a number of sub-projects within that, I suppose. Researchers, then me, Christine Hauskeller, mostly, most, we're the core of it, but we also have the face you can see down there's sociologist Ernesto Schwarz-Marin, we have Talene Artinian, then we have other people joining us all the time, like I said, Luis Eduardo Luna, we have Cyrus Gonzalez Romero, a Mexican philosopher, looking at psychedelic humanities, and so on. We have a master's module. We're in the middle of it now. We're on week what are we now? Yeah, week 9 now. Looking at cognitive liberty today. Later on, so we have a really nice class. I believe the first ever academic master's module on philosophy and psychedelics. We have this great transdisciplinary research colloquium on psychedelics. So this came about because we joined forces with the psychology department, and the reason was that the world's leading researcher on ketamine, Professor Celia Morgan, also happens to work at Exeter University. So we thought we have to do something together, and we did. And we're doing this great colloquium. It's really interesting. We usually have guest speakers. In this photograph, you can see Ben Sessa there in the middle. It's hybrid, so it's online and in person. We've got David Arizzo today, who's like the sort of successor of Robin Carhart Harris in London. We had Chris Timmerman last week and so on. So interestingly, we've got philosophers, psychologists, but also sociologists, anthropologists, looking at these people's work, but then sort of in a critical way, sort of criticizing certain assumptions that each discipline has on the other. We've got a conference that you see mentioned in April this year. We had it. We're now organizing another one for next year, and that will be really geared towards early career researchers and PhD students mostly. So if you're interested in that, let me know. We've got also coming out, it's now in production, from Bloomsbury, publish Harry Potter, the edited volume Philosophy and Psychedelics. Jussi has an amazing chapter in that called Mary on Acid. I've got one on Spinozism then. I can go through that in Q&A if you like. That's coming out in May, hopefully next year. I mean, these things drag on. And then I've got my own book coming out in a few weeks, Modes of Sentience. So there's a lot of Whitehead in that. There's an essay on Humphrey Davey, as I mentioned. There's a last essays on the nexus or the connection, intertwinement between sentience or mentality and dimensional space. And then there's the history of philosophers and psychedelics and so on. Anyway, I think my time is up, more or less. So thanks for your time. I will now gladly take questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter. That was almost a breathtaking array of possible research topics for also Finnish researchers and students, and also like possibilities for collaboration internationally. So this is like everything on a plate given to us. So thank you very much for that. So questions and comments, please. I also have my own, but the local people can start.
Okay.
Do we have online stuff? Yes, there is in questions and answers. I will read aloud. If the psychedelic experience is contextual to one's culture, can you comment on experiences that people have about meeting entities, gods, energies from different cultures or feelings of being? That is in a jungle on the other side of the world, even though the person has never been on that area.
Well, I mean, first of all, I'm undecided on this question, to be honest. I think I'd take a middle way because, for example, with entities in the Americas, and I've been studying this great book, got it here actually, called The Falling Sky by David Kopenauer, who's a Yanomami shaman. It's one of the only books directly from an indigenous person speaking about his experiences. So they do have, psychedelic use is intrinsic to their whole culture, the condition of it, and their what cosmology, really, their animist cosmology. They do have experiences of animal spirits and small beings and so on, which is somewhat similar to what we experience here. But of course, they've got different names for it and a different etiology, a different sort of, they don't identify them obviously with other things. So there are commonalities like that, which possibly indicate that culture, that's my timer, which possibly indicate that there's a kind of transcultural element to this. I mean, you generally say there's a transcultural element to a lot of drugs. Like, you wouldn't think cocaine was very different in the South America compared to Europe, for example. But of course, if one sees Jesus, like, for example, in the Good Friday experiment in America, you're going to think there's got to be some cultural influence there. They never see Jesus or any figure like that in the Americas. You think there must be something. They see a lot of jaguar snakes and something. For me, the interesting question is the unitive experience or type of unitive experience. It just doesn't seem to be on the phenomenology of the Americans, the Amerindians rather. Although it is in the West. And the East, a lot of Eastern philosophy, of course, came into the West and analyses of these in the 20th century. So, but there's use of 5-MeO-DMT in the Americas, and I need to look into this more. Something I'm looking into, whether that experience really is distinct or whether it's the same. How could one even decipher that? This is all early stuff that needs a lot of thought and a lot of investigation. So I don't know the answer to it. But I personally think there are probably some cultural experiences, yet many experiences on psychedelics are also culturally conditioned. So some kind of sort of diplomatic third way. That's what I take. But I don't know the answer.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience, and now I will put you temporarily on mute so that we can hear there. And please, Samuli Kangaslampi, he's the head of the Psychedelic Research Association in Finland.
Yes, thank you very much, Peter, for this fascinating talk, really giving an overview of the different areas of philosophy that psychedelics could relate to. I was wondering, could you give a brief 2-minute version on psychedelics and Spinoza? Which aspects of Spinoza's philosophy and interests do psychedelics most resonate into?
Right. Well, 2 minutes. Okay. So yeah, it's in the book, the Bloomsbury book, my chapter on it. Spinoza is called Spinozism and the Psychedelic Amor Dei Intellectualis. So I don't know how to say this. I don't know how much, I'll probably lose a few people here on technicalities, but Spinoza then, first of all, I should say that pantheism and monism seem to be quite prevalent in psychedelic circles generally. This is something Patrick Lundborg speaks about, and I can provide references later if you email me. So pantheism was coined by Joseph Raphson, and that was named after Spinoza's philosophy. So if psychedelics involve pantheism commonly interpreted that way, then we should look at the original pantheist. I mean, okay, Bruno was there before in ancient Greeks, but so how does it relate? Well, I'm interested in in Spinoza's main work, the Ethics. He puts forward his monism, his pantheism, his whole philosophy really. And he speaks about 3 kinds of knowledge. And the first kind is general opinion, sense data, sensible knowledge, The second one is scientific reasoning and logic, basically, inference, validity, empirical research. There's a third kind of knowledge, which Spinoza talks about, which he calls intuition. And Spinoza scholars differ widely on what this means. There's a real huge range, as you might know. But the peak of the third kind of knowledge is what he calls the intellectual love of God. And of course, by God, he means nature. So the intellectual love of nature. And by love, he doesn't mean human form of love. And by intellectual, he doesn't mean the intellect. So it gets very confusing. But he talks about it being a sort of merging into the real essence of things, which are not abstracted into extension and thought. So it's like Kant's intellectual intuition. It's like a real emergence or sort of integration into the reality itself. That is God. One becomes God. God becomes one. There's an obvious influence from Maimonides there. The Jewish philosopher Maimonides, Rambam, who talks about sort of integration into the infinite mind as well. So I look at that, and I look at the phenomenology of 5-MeO-DMT, especially because its unitive nature, non-perceptual and unitive nature, because the third kind of knowledge is non-perceptual for Spinoza as well, but it's also eternal. In other words, timeless. It's outside of time. So one can, at least I found it quite interesting to compare such phenomenology with such metaphysics. And that would then provide a veridical framework for the experience, away from mere hallucination to something a little bit more objective. But of course, this is all ultimately speculative.
Yes, thank you. And you also write about this in the conference volume.
Yes.
Yeah, I have a question here in between, and you also have, so you can be next one. There are some also in the questions and answers, but I think a really central question here, because we have like these two strands, 2 approaches to philosophy of psychedelics. One is this really naturalistic, like Leatherby, and then there are these more metaphysical, which take the metaphysical insights in psychedelic experience seriously. And I must ask like a general question to you. What do you think about the objection that belief in cosmic consciousness or transmissive theory of consciousness, or these kinds of ideas, or God even. You can select which aspect you want to focus on. But what do you think about the objection that these beliefs or insights are apparent insights? They are not compatible with naturalism and science, and therefore they are false. How do you respond?
Well, I mean, I also see naturalism as a metaphysical perspective, and you can trace that perspective to, Descartes, Galileo, essentially, and beyond. And of course, there are many metaphysical issues with it. I mean, I like to distinguish between science as a method and then physicalism or naturalism as a belief system. And I think these questions ultimately are open. I mean, of course, it's useful to assume naturalism when one's doing science in terms of methodology, but ultimately, these are open questions that psychedelic experience, I think, make a little bit more, opens one's mind to it a little bit more, at least opens one's mind to studying them in a little more detail. I mean, another issue with assuming naturalism for that is the question with regard to philosophy of ethics, because it's very hard to ground an objective, and if you want to, or it's very hard to ground ethics in naturalism. Of course, there are attempts, but ultimately, if we look at the naturalist ethicists, meta-ethicists of the 20th century, people like Mackey and Stevenson, people like that, I mean, you have there ultimately a form that, propositions, moral propositions cannot be, verified or falsified, and thus they are either meaningless or an error or something like this, and also ultimately a faith belief. So with naturalism, you've got problems like the hard problem of consciousness and so on and so forth, which sort of indicate this, it's not complete, at the very least, not complete. And then you've got ethical issues about using naturalism as the basis for like improving people's mental health, because you can't, it's very hard at least to establish morality upon it for therapy. So I mean, so what should I say? I mean, I think, yeah, there's interesting two approaches, but I prefer not to take a physicalist approach. I think it's a bit too limiting. Also, maybe it causes mental problems sociologically. There's another debate. Also, like question of what naturalism is. Galen Strawson says his panpsychism is a naturalism, real naturalism, he calls it. So, yeah, so although there are two, I mean, there's generally, many strands in philosophy, and as you know, we all completely disagree with one another. But I like to keep my options open rather than assuming anything.
Good, thank you. And then we take from the audience. I will again.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I was left thinking about the comforting delusion problem, or whatever you call it, objection. Doesn't that presuppose a sort of naturalism as a priori to be an objection? What I'm thinking is, to my mind, the primary thing that you get from psychedelic, if it's comforting, I'm not sure how you can call it a delusion unless you postulate a priori a certain kind of naturalism, which sort of feels to me that it's making so many presuppositions that I don't feel the strength of the objection, but I wonder if I'm missing something here.
Well, no, you're right. I mean, okay, so Chris Leatherby's book, which is all about the comforting delusion objection, presupposes, explicitly says, on the assumption of naturalism, then this, like cosmic consciousness, whatever that means, must be a delusion. Yet it can be therapeutic. And you can either sort of say, no, it's not a delusion because naturalism is false. You can say, yes, it is a delusion, but yet you can still, it doesn't matter ethically, you can still treat people. Or you can say, yes, it is a delusion and it's unethical to treat people via a delusion. But Chris Leatherby takes fourth route and says, no, there are certain veridical insights psychedelics yield, which are not delusions, so insights about oneself, you see. So he takes that route. But of course, yeah, he's sort of dedicated naturalist, by which he means physicalist. I don't like the word naturalism because, of course, everyone thinks they're a naturalist. They think nature's real. The question is what it includes, right? So physicalist is a bit more to the point. I mean, this is the thing. I mean, so Timmerman's paper, which I think Chris Leatherby was actually a co-author too, says, yeah, psychedelics do shift. There's evidence that they do shift people away from physicalism. This was the main motion. The problems with that paper, like I said, methodologically and ontologically, but nonetheless, if they do shift them, I don't think, I'm in agreement with you, I don't think we should just think a priori that is therefore delusion. I mean, the fact of the matter is we don't know the truth about the reality of existence, right? So I just prefer to be open-minded, and then it allows for more interesting research as well.
Yeah. Or does it answer your question? Good. Yes, online audience. Let's see. I will check the. You can read it from there. That's good. Yeah. In a moment, you will get a question from online audience.
Yes, question from Anssi Pitkänen. Have you given thought to Jung's ideas about archetypes as the self-organizing principles of the psyche in relation to psychedelic phenomenology?
Hume's or Jung's? Sorry, Jung's, I guess you mean. Yes.
Yes, Carl Jung.
Carl Jung, yeah. I somehow heard Hume. I missed something there. Okay. I have given it thought, and I believe that you have my colleague Joanna Sapanen, fellow Finn, speaking later about this. So I should really leave that to her, as she knows much more about it. There's also a chapter in our Bloomsbury book. She's contributed on that. It's a really fascinating topic, but it's not my field. So just wait a few hours, I think.
Yes, thank you. Shall we take? Is there other questions here? I also have infinitely many questions to you, but from the questions and answers, do you want to ask another one from there?
Sure. Tuulikki Antero wonders, what is your take on the relationship between psychedelics and the birth of Christianity? Perhaps a more speculative question. She's referring to the book, The Immortality Key, mainly.
Well, I haven't read all of that book, The Immortality Key by Brian. What can I say? I don't. I mean, there are all these literatures on, the sacred mushroom as the beginning of Christianity and so on. I'm skeptical about it all, but the truth is I haven't really looked into it. I know that the Christians shut down the mysteries, and like I said, the Roman Emperor Theodosius I in 392 closed down the Eleusinian mysteries. And then, of course, you have the conquistadors coming to the Americas and calling their psychedelic use and the visions induced there by satanic and so on. So there's been a kind of rough relationship between Christianity and psychedelics. I mean, I think it's a competition. It's another form of, can be seen as another form of spirituality. This is also interesting with regard to the question of ecology and Christianity in relation to nature connectedness. And also there's an interesting relationship between Christianity or Platonic Christianity and dualism. But I'm not really a Christian historian. And and also it would have to be very speculative, that kind of connection. So I'll leave it.
Yes, thank you. Basically, we are out of time, but because as I'm the chair, I give the chance to everybody to go to the poster session, and I will come there soon. But because I have you here now, I have to ask about, because like everybody says that David Nutt says that Huxley was right. What does it mean? Because there is at least like two alternative interpretations, because on the brain level, it's sort of, you could defend the thesis that when you like reduce brain activity, you increase consciousness, you increase like brain entropy, and you increase consciousness. And entropy is like, well, it's like this parable sort of, so it's not clear either. You could think that when you die, your entropy increases, but that's not so clear either. So even on the level of the brain, the logic is a bit unclear. What does it mean that Huxley would be right in the case of the neuroscientific data? And this is like on the brain level, it's unclear. And then we have the metaphysical side, and I think that we need to keep these two distinct if we can. Because on the metaphysical level, the transmissive theory is like this cosmic consciousness or ground of being that is like funneled through our bodies into these forms. I am a form of this like cosmic consciousness. And this is the metaphysical idea. So is it either or, like this brain idea or the metaphysical theory, or is it both?
Well, that's a very difficult question. I'll just say this, that the truth of the matter is David Nutt doesn't, he's a great scientist, but he doesn't know his metaphysics, right? So then when he says Huxley was right, does he really know what that means? And this is why he and I are going to write a book about it, not just this question, but looking at it in a bit more detail, and what that means. Metaphysically, there's new literature at the moment on what is called cosmopsychism, which is this kind of basic cosmic consciousness. It's kind of the academic word for pantheism, to be honest. And yeah, so the question as to, so that in itself needs to be understood, as you say, as on a metaphysical level. What does it mean? And then on an empirical level, what tests could differentiate these two metaphysical theories? An interesting question, like when I say two metaphysical theories, I mean this Bergsonian theory that we receive and filter, the reducing valve consciousness from what Huxley calls, not Bergson, mind at large. Bergson's much more very detailed in terms of memory and so on, So what would be the empirical distinction between that reducing valve theory and the emergentist theory, that the brain produces the mind, And this emergentism, as it's known, of course, is prevalent now. I think is a sort of axiom, unquestioned axiom of most neuroscience, it seems to me. That's what Jae-Kwon Kim says, at least. But it's very problematic. We don't have these transordinal laws between, physical things moving and phenomenological things emerging therefrom. There's correlative laws, but the question is the relationship between, this is the mind-matter mystery, what is the relationship? What is that correlation? What is the actual relation? Is it emergence? Is it identity? This, as some philosophers will know, hit kind of cul-de-sac in the 20th century because of multiple realization. Is it dualism? Is there a common cause for both? Going into Spinozism a little bit more, and how would those metaphysical? This is another interesting research question, right? How would one empirically differentiate these metaphysical views? Because you would expect perfect correlation between your thoughts and the brain under Bergson's theory as well.
Yes,
we would expect exactly the same correlation as we presently have. So can it even be determined empirically? This is an interesting question in itself before one does that research.
And in that case, that would render Professor Nutt's statement like nonsensical, because then brain data could not verify or prove Huxley right. In that case. In that case, but maybe that's not the case. Maybe maybe there are empirical tests that could be made. I should do that. But I have to say that I have to advise everybody to read your work to find out more, and I'm sure that we will discuss these matters again, and maybe after all this Corona stuff, we will meet in person, and you will get to come to Finland live, hopefully someday.
I'd love to. Thank you.
Well, let's thank Peter once more.